The Marston Club stood at the end of St. James's Street, like a man who had never doubted himself, stone-faced, lamp-lit, entirely indifferent to the cold. Francis Holt had been inside it precisely twice in 16 years, and both times through the servants' entrance, and both times because Hugh Ainsley, Viscount Sefton, had sent word that something was needed, and she was the only one who knew where it was. Tonight the message had come at 8:30, written in his own hand. The Whitmore papers. Urgent. The club by 9. She had found them in the estate box where she had placed them 3 weeks prior, wrapped in the brown paper she herself had tied, and she had walked the quarter-mile from Brook Street through the January dark, with the parcel under her arm and her shawl drawn close against a wind that cut without apology. The footman who admitted her was polite in the way of men who are polite to people they do not need to please. He showed her to the anteroom beside the butler's room and told her to wait, and she waited, standing rather than sitting, the parcel held against her coat, while from beyond the half-open door the sounds of the club's inner evening carried clearly through the quiet corridor. The clink of glass, the low percussion of masculine laughter, and then, distinct above it, a voice she did not know asking a question she heard every word of. "Tell me, Sefton, how does a man endure having the Holt about the place? All these years, does she not wear on you?" There was a pause, and then Hugh Ainsley's voice, easy and unhurried, shaped precisely for an audience. "One endures it as one endures any charity one did not choose," he said. "Duty imposed her. What can one do? She is a burden the family owed, and I have borne it. No one will thank me for it, I expect. But then no one thanks a man for keeping astray from the street." The laughter that followed was brief and comfortable. The laughter of men who found the observation neither cruel nor remarkable, only accurate and mildly diverting. Frances did not move. She stood in the ante-room with the Whitmore papers against her chest and the laughter still warm in the air, and she did not gasp, did not press her hand to her mouth, did not allow any sound to leave her body that had not already been living there for a very long time. She was 41 years old. She had managed the Sefton household accounts, the Brook Street correspondence, the Wraxall tenant ledgers, the social calendar, the quarterly creditor payments, and the upbringing of a small girl named Cecily for 16 years. She had done all of this without a title, without a salary properly rendered, and without, she now understood with a clarity that surprised her only in its completeness, any illusion she had been fool enough to hold. She set the Whitmore papers on the table beside the door. She spoke to the footman who had returned to his post at the corridor's end. "Would you see that Lord Sefton receives those when he is at liberty?" she said. "I shall not trouble anyone further this evening." The footman said he would see to it. Frances drew her shawl around her shoulders, pulled her gloves on finger by finger, and walked out through the servants' entrance into the January street. She did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. She walked the quarter-mile back to Brook Street at the same pace she had come, and the wind was still cutting, and the lamps along the pavement threw their familiar yellow light across the stone. And none of it was different from the way it had been an hour ago, except that she was. At Brook Street, she went directly to her room, not the bedroom she had been given as a guest when she first arrived at 25, which had been small and pleasant and temporary, but the room she had occupied for 16 years, which was smaller and less pleasant, and which she had long since stopped thinking of as temporary. She lit the lamp. She sat at the writing table she had purchased herself from a second-hand dealer in Marylebone 8 years ago, because the desk provided had been inadequate for the volume of correspondence she was expected to manage. She took out 2 sheets of paper. On the first, she wrote a careful accounting of wages, not the allowance. The allowance was something else, a gesture toward the appearance of arrangement, not the arrangement itself. But wages, calculated at the rate a competent housekeeper and estate manager would have commanded over 16 years. less what had been provided in room and board, and the figure that remained was not a small one. She did not expect to recover it. She wrote it down because it was true, and the act of writing true things on paper was one of the few satisfactions available to her at this hour. On the second sheet, she wrote a list of what she would take. It was not a long list. Her own clothing, her writing table, which she had paid for, the account books she had maintained in her own hand, which were her work and no one else's, a small watercolor her mother had painted, the writing case her father had given her the year before he died. 16 years in a house, and the list fit on half a page. She spent the night in preparation. She was methodical about it, because methodical was the only register she trusted. When the house was still and the clock on the landing had struck 4, she sealed a note for Mrs. Fenwick, practical instructions about the quarterly accounts, a list of the arrendatarios who were reliable, and which of the two who were not, and placed it on the kitchen table where it would be found in the morning. She did not write to Sefton. There was nothing she needed to say to him that he would hear, and she had spent 16 years saying things he did not hear, and she was done. She was gone before 6, in the dark, with her trunk on the carrier's cart and the watercolor wrapped in her spare dress and the writing case on her lap, and the house behind her as silent as it always was at that hour, and as silent as it would remain. She knew, for considerably longer than anyone in it yet understood. Sefton came back from the Marston Club in excellent spirits, pleasantly warmed by brandy and the easy company of men who found him agreeable, and went to bed without noticing that the Whitmore papers had been left by the door rather than delivered to his study. He slept well. He ate breakfast with Cecily the following morning and noticed that the eggs were done correctly and the post had been sorted, and it was Cecily who first put the question into the air. "Where is Miss Holt?" Cecily asked. She was 9 years old, precise and watchful in the manner of children who have learned to track the moods of the adults around them. "Resting, I expect," Sefton said, and turned the page of his newspaper. But Miss Holt was not at luncheon, and her place at the small parlor table was set and then cleared untouched. And it was not until a letter arrived from one of the Wraxall arrendatarios, a man named Garvey, writing in a hand so contracted and abbreviated that it required a particular skill to parse, that Sefton felt the first edge of inconvenience. He read the letter twice, understood perhaps a third of it, and set it aside with the intention of handing it to Frances when she appeared. She did not appear. By the third day, he told himself she had taken herself off on some private errand and would be back before the week was out. Because women in her situation, women without independent income, without family connections of any practical use, without the kind of social standing that opened doors on its own, did not simply leave. They had nowhere to go. It was, he reflected, not a cruel observation, but simply a factual one. She would return when her temper had cooled, and they would say nothing about it, and life would resume. Frances, meanwhile, was in Pennfold. She had arrived on the carrier's coach on a Tuesday morning, stiff from the journey and carrying everything she owned in a trunk that the coaching inn's boy helped her down with for a penny. She had engaged a room at Mrs. Alderton's lodging house on the High Street, a clean room with a window that faced south and a fireplace that drew properly. And on Wednesday morning she had presented herself at the offices of Dunmore and Vane, solicitors, and inquired whether they had need of a bookkeeper. Mr. Dunmore was a small, deliberate man of 60-something, who wore the same gray coat on every occasion and who, when Frances placed before him a sample of her ledger work and a brief accounting of her experience, looked at it for 4 minutes without speaking and then said, "Can you start Thursday?" She started Thursday. By the following Monday she was seated at a desk of her own, a good solid desk by the window, with a proper lamp and a pen rest that did not wobble. Copying accounts for the firm's property clients at a rate agreed in advance and paid at the end of each week, in coin, directly into her hand. The work was not different in kind from what she had been doing at Brook Street. What was different was that when she completed a column and it balanced, Mr. Dunmore looked at it and said, "Good," and meant it as a plain statement of fact, not a condescension, not a favor. On the Saturday of her first week, she took her wages to the seamstress 2 doors down from the lodging house, a brisk woman named Mrs. Tarrant, who looked at Frances's one good dress and said she could have the worn elbows mended and the hem turned by Tuesday. Frances said that would suit her. She paid for the work herself, in her own money, without asking anyone's permission or explaining herself to anyone in the world. At Brook Street, on that same Saturday, a tradesman named Holloway arrived at the front door and was told by the footman that Lord Sefton was not at home. Holloway said he was not there to see Lord Sefton, but to speak to whoever was managing the household accounts, as his last 3 invoices had gone unacknowledged. The footman had no answer for this. He closed the door. Holloway stood on the step for a moment, then turned and walked away. And the door stayed closed, and behind it, the footman stood in the hall with the distinct and unfamiliar sensation that something had stopped working, though he could not have said exactly what. Sefton, when the footman reported this exchange, stared at the closed door without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "Send word to Miss Holt's room." "Miss Holt's room is empty, my lord," the footman said. "Has been since Tuesday." Sefton looked at him. "Empty," he repeated. "Yes, my lord," the footman confirmed. Sefton went to his club. Pennfold in January was not beautiful in any obvious way. The high street was narrow, the market square was small. The fields beyond the town were stripped and gray under a low sky. But it had a quality that Frances found herself returning to in her thoughts during the first weeks. It was quiet in the right way. Not the quiet of a house holding its breath around a man's moods, but the quiet of a place that did not require anything of her beyond what she agreed to provide. She ate when she was hungry. She walked in the evenings along the lane behind the lodging house, where someone had planted a kitchen garden against the south-facing wall. Dormant now, but clearly well tended. And she found herself stopping to look at it on her way past in a way she had not stopped to look at anything in a very long time. She had not had a headache in 3 weeks. She noticed this one morning while dressing and stood for a moment with her brush in her hand, counting backwards, and the count held. At Brook Street, the disintegration moved faster now, though Sefton was not yet equipped to see it as disintegration. He saw it as inconvenience, a sequence of small, unrelated inconveniences that would resolve themselves if he gave them time. A second creditor's letter arrived, this one with a tone that was less polite than the first. A rent collection at Wraxall went unmade because no one at Brook Street could locate the schedule that specified which arrendatario owed which sum on which date. And the schedule was in Frances's handwriting in a ledger that was no longer on the estate shelf where it should have been, because Frances had taken it, because it was her work and she had known, perhaps, that she was taking the knowledge with her. Cecily had stopped asking where Miss Holt was. She had begun instead to sit alone in the back parlor after her lessons were finished, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. Mrs. Fenwick, who had been with the household for 20 years and who had read Frances's note 3 times before folding it carefully into her apron pocket, sometimes found the child there and sat with her without speaking, which was the most honest thing either of them had to offer. Sefton rode to his club and found Lionel Crail waiting for him at his usual table with a glass already poured and an expression of sympathetic concern that sat on his face as naturally as a man's own features. "I hear things are a little tangled at Brook Street," Crail said. A temporary disruption, Sefton said. Of course, said Crail. Still, while things are temporarily disrupted, I've had a look at the consolidated position as a friend. And I think there may be a way through that is rather less painful than it might appear. He opened his coat and produced a set of papers, neatly folded, already drawn. It's really only a matter of a signature. I've structured it to give you breathing room. Sefton looked at the papers. He was a man accustomed to the existence of arrangements he did not fully understand, managed by people he trusted to understand them on his behalf. He read what he could, found it reasonable in its general outline, and signed. In Pennfold, Frances opened the ledger for Dunmore's office, dipped her pen, and entered the first figure of the afternoon's work. She checked it against the source document. She entered the second. Both were correct. She knew they were correct because she had checked them herself, and when Dunmore checked them at the end of the week, he would find them correct also, and he would say so, and she would be paid. She entered the third figure and noted, with something she recognized after a moment as satisfaction. A small, clean, uncomplicated satisfaction. That every number she placed on this page belonged to a world that was making sense. No one here would call it charity. He wrote into Pennfold on a Thursday afternoon with the particular confidence of a man who has already determined the shape of the conversation he is about to have. He had asked at the coaching inn, and they had pointed him toward Dunmore's office, and he had waited across the street until the door opened, and Frances came out into the thin afternoon light with a ledger under her arm and her coat buttoned to the throat against the cold. She looked well. That was the first thing he registered, and it surprised him. Not that she should look well, but that she looked different in a way he could not immediately name. She was walking with her head up. She was not looking anywhere in particular, simply walking at her own pace, as though the afternoon belonged to her. He crossed the street and raised his hand, and she saw him, and her expression did not change in the way he had expected. No relief, no embarrassment, no quick adjustment toward welcome. She simply stopped and waited. "Frances," he said. "Lord Sefton," she replied. He reached the door of Dunmore's office where she stood and put his hand out to stop her. Not thinking, not deciding, simply moving as men move when they expect to be obeyed, and placed it flat over her hand on the doorframe. Both of them went still. It was the first time in 15 years that he had touched her deliberately. He knew it the instant it happened, and from the way she went perfectly motionless under his hand. She knew it too. He pulled back as though the wood had burned him, and they stood a foot apart in the January street with the moment between them, like something that had been dropped and could not be picked up again. He tried charm first, because charm was his first and most reliable instrument. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said. "Whatever upset you, and I can see that something did, I am sure it can be resolved. Brook Street is not itself without you. Cecily asks after you. Come back and we will say nothing more about it." "I am not upset," Frances said. "Then why?" "Because I heard you," she said. The words were quiet and entirely steady. "At the Marston Club, through the door. I heard every word." He opened his mouth and then closed it, and something moved across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two, and he chose, as he always chose when cornered, to push through. "It was a careless remark," he said, "made to amuse the room. Surely you cannot—" "I am not asking you to account for it," Frances said. "I am telling you why I left. You asked, so I am telling you." "You have no income," he said. And the authority came into his voice now, the flat certainty of a man who has always understood the world in terms of what people could and could not afford to do. You have no connections that will serve you. You have no position outside the one I provided. Whatever you think you are doing here, it cannot last. And when it fails, you will find yourself in a considerably worse situation than the one you left. I have a position, Francis said. I am paid for it. I have a room that is mine. I have enough to eat. I gave you a roof for 16 years. Yes, she said, and in return, I gave you 16 years. She did not raise her voice. She spoke as she always spoke when she was most certain of something. Quietly, without decoration, each word placed where it needed to go. I managed your house, your estate, your accounts, your correspondence, your tenants, your creditors, your niece's education, and your social calendar. I did it without a proper wage, without a title, without acknowledgement of any kind. And at the end of 16 years, you used me to amuse strangers. A burden, you said. A stray from the street. Francis, I would rather be poor and a person, she said, than comfortable in furniture. And I find that I am not, in fact, as poor as you assumed I would be. He had no answer that functioned. He stood in the January street outside Dunmore's office with every instrument he had ever used, charm, authority, the weight of social logic, the practical argument, lying flat in the cold air between them. And she stood on the other side of it, looking at him with an expression that was not angry and was not forgiving, and was simply terribly clear. He rode back to London with a specific and unfamiliar sensation that he had been seen clearly by someone who had looked directly at him for 15 years and had now, for the first time, said plainly what she found. The fever came on a Sunday. Cecily had been quiet for 2 days before it, which Mrs. Fenwick had attributed to the cold weather and the child's general unhappiness. And so it was not until Sunday morning, when the child's temperature climbed sharply and she could not keep water down, that Mrs. Fenwick understood what they were dealing with. A lung fever, the doctor said when he came at noon. Fast moving, the kind that required watching. He left a list of instructions and a bottle of medicine and said someone must sit with her through the night. The Brook Street household had been, since Francis's departure, a household in which each person did their own work and nothing beyond it, because the person who had seen what needed doing and done it without being asked was gone. Mrs. Fenwick looked at the doctor's instructions, looked at the stripped-down staff, looked at Sefton standing in the corridor with his coat still on and his face doing something she had never seen it do before, and made a decision. She sent for Francis directly. She did not consult Sefton. She wrote the note herself, sent it by the fastest available boy, and had a reply within 3 hours. I will come this evening. Francis arrived at Brook Street at 6:30, with a small bag, and her coat still buttoned from the cold. Sefton was in the hall when she came through the door, and he began to speak. She saw him draw breath, saw him assemble something, and she walked past him without stopping. Mrs. Fenwick, she said to the housekeeper, who had appeared at the top of the stairs. What is her temperature now? And when did she last take water? She spent the next 3 nights in the sick room. Sefton sat with her through the first night and most of the second, and they kept watch in near silence, which was the only register available to them in that room, and which was, in its way, the most honest they had been with each other in years. Francis changed the compresses and tracked the temperature and administered the medicine at the intervals the doctor had specified. And Sefton sat in the chair by the window and watched her work with the expression of a man learning, slowly and at great cost, the dimensions of something he had never measured. On the second night, in the small hours when Cecily's breathing had steadied into something closer to sleep, Frances fell asleep in the chair from exhaustion. Simply fell, without warning, the way people fall when they have been running for too long. Her head came forward and her breathing changed, and she was gone. Sefton sat for a moment without moving. Then he rose from the window chair, took his own coat from the peg on the back of the door, and carried it across the room and laid it over her shoulders. He stood looking at her for a long time after that. He was not thinking clearly enough to call what he was doing anything. He was simply standing in the dark room with his niece breathing steadily in the bed, and the woman who had held his household together for 16 years asleep in the chair with his coat over her. And something in the arrangement of these facts was doing something to him that he did not yet have words for. Mrs. Fenwick passed in the corridor at some point in the night, and looked through the partly open door and chose, with the wisdom of a woman who has seen a great deal in 20 years of service, not to disturb what she saw. On the third night, when Cecily's fever finally broke and the child drank half a glass of water and asked in a thin voice whether Miss Holt was there, Mrs. Fenwick came and sat beside Sefton in the corridor while Frances was inside with the child, and she told him quietly about the pearls. 2 winters ago, she said, when the funds ran short, shorter than usual, and no one seemed to know why, she sold her mother's pearls to pay the servants' wages. Her mother's, my lord. Her only inheritance. She told no one. She simply did it and said nothing. And the wages were paid. Sefton sat with this for a long time, without speaking. When Cecily was out of danger and sleeping naturally, Frances came out of the sick room and found him in the corridor. He stood up when she appeared. "Stay," he said. It was not a command. It was something else, and both of them heard the difference. "I came for Cecily," Frances said. She said it without cruelty, but without softening either. "Not for you." And that distinction is not a small one. She went to collect her bag, and in the morning she was on the carrier's coach back to Pennfold, and the distinction stood in the Brook Street corridor long after she was gone, occupying the space where she had been. The letter from Crail arrived on a Wednesday, on thick paper with a firm seal, and its language was the language of a man who has been patient for a long time, and has now decided that patience has served its purpose. The consolidated debts were called. The date for a forced auction was set. Brook Street and its contents, Wraxall Hall and the tenant properties, staff and arrendatarios and all. The letter was precise about the timeline and pleasant about the options. There was, Crail wrote, one civilized exit. He had identified a young woman of considerable fortune whose family was amenable to a negotiated arrangement. The brokerage terms were attached. Sefton had only to agree, and the matter would be resolved without the unpleasantness of public auction. Sefton sat with this letter for a full day. He sat with it in his study, and then in his club, and then in his study again, and the shape of what it meant became clearer the longer he looked at it. In Pennfold, old Dunmore arrived at Frances's lodgings on the Thursday evening without announcement, carrying a leather satchel that he set on her table with the care of a man handling something he has thought about for a long time. "I have been looking at the Sefton accounts," he said, "the ones that passed through this office before the consolidation. Sit down, Miss Holt. This will take some time." It took 2 hours. He laid it out methodically, the way he did everything. Systematic transfers over 6 years, each one structured to fall just beneath the threshold that Frances's oversight would have caught. Each one routed through a sub-account that appeared legitimate on a single ledger review, but which, when mapped against the full estate picture, formed a pattern as clear as handwriting. The transfers had accelerated in the 2 winters when Frances had been most occupied. The winter Cecily had scarlet fever, The winter the Wraxall roof needed emergency repair, and the accounts had been in upheaval for 3 months. The timing was not accidental. Dunmore placed the satchel in her hands at the end of it. "There is enough here to present to the creditors," he said. "Crail's scheme would unravel in front of the room. The genuine debts are manageable. The Wraxall core is solvent. The tenant properties and the farms can be protected. Brook Street and the London life, those are gone regardless. But the people who depend on that land need not be." Frances held the satchel on her lap. She sat with what she was holding after Dunmore left, and she understood it precisely. She held the means to break Crail completely and publicly, to protect the Wraxall tenants and the household staff from the dispersal that would otherwise end their livelihoods. She also held, if she chose to use it differently, if she chose to set it down and walk away, the means to let everything collapse cleanly without her name attached to its failure. Sefton would lose it all. Crail would collect. The arrendatarios and the servants would scatter. She thought about Garvey, who had farmed the North Field at Wraxall for 30 years. She thought about the 4 families in the tenant cottages, whose names she knew and whose children she had helped register for the parish school. She thought about Mrs. Fenwick, who had folded her note into her apron pocket and said nothing and sent for her when Cecily needed her. She closed the satchel. She did not open it again until morning. She sent word to Brook Street that she would come once more, not to stay, but to review the accounts before the creditors' meeting. She named a date and a time and said she would require Dunmore and a hired clerk and a room with a large table. Sefton met her at the Brook Street door when she arrived. He did not attempt to speak first, which was new, and she noted it without comment. He simply stepped back and let her in. The back parlor had been cleared for the purpose, the furniture pushed to the walls, the table in the center, the lamp turned high. Dunmore arrived at 7:30 with his satchel and his gray coat, and the clerk arrived shortly after, and they began. They worked from after supper until 3 in the morning. It was the first time in 15 years that Frances and Sefton had sat at the same table as equals. No domestic hierarchy, no performance of his authority and her utility, no careful arrangement of who stood and who sat and who addressed whom. They were 2 people working a problem that required both of them, and the work was too large and too urgent for anything else. Sefton was not incompetent, Frances discovered. He had been incompetent about the accounts because he had never needed to be competent about them. But when the structure was laid in front of him and the stakes were clear, he worked with a focused intelligence that she had occasionally glimpsed before and never had reason to observe directly. He asked good questions. When he did not understand something, he said so rather than pretending, which was more than she had expected. Partway through the night, he looked up from a column of figures and asked directly, "This routing entry in the 3rd quarter, is it the same account as the February transfer, or a different vehicle?" "The same," Frances said. "Same account number, same holding structure, different calendar quarter. That is what makes it look separate on a single-year review." He looked at it for a moment. "You would have caught this," he said. "Yes," she said. "You caught it before, didn't you? Earlier entries, you flagged them." "I flagged anomalies in the accounts twice," she said. "In the 3rd year and the 5th. You referred them to Crail to review." He set the ledger down. He did not say anything for a moment. "He told me they were clerical errors," he said. "I expect he did," she said. She said it without heat, without triumph, without any of the anger she might have carried into this room and had, somewhere between Pennfold and Brook Street, set down. She said it because it was true, and because the night was not finished and there was still work to do. And Sefton looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who has finally, at considerable cost, understood the dimensions of his own house. "I never once said the word correct," he said. Not to her, not quite, but not to himself either. "Somewhere between." "No," she agreed. "You did not." They found the final proof an hour before 3. A routing entry in the 6th-year ledger that matched Dunmore's earlier discovery exactly. Same account, same structure. The last piece that made the full pattern irrefutable. Frances's finger came to rest on the entry, and she held it there. And Sefton's hand came down over hers on the papers, and he held it. Held her hand under his on the page that was 15 years of her invisible work, made suddenly, undeniably visible. She did not move away. They stayed like that for a moment that neither of them put into words. The lamp burning low, and Dunmore at the far end of the table giving his attention very deliberately to the ledger in front of him. And then Dunmore set the next volume on the table and said, "The Michaelmas accounts, if you're ready." And they continued working. The creditors' meeting convened at 10 in the morning in the bare front room of Brook Street, where the furniture had already been tagged for the auction with small white labels that fluttered slightly when the door opened. 8 men were present, creditors or their representatives, the family solicitor, and Lionel Crail, who had arranged himself at the head of the table with the ease of a man arriving to collect what is already his. He wore a good coat and a pleasant expression, and greeted the assembled company with the warmth of a man who expects to be thanked. Frances entered last. She set Dunmore's satchel on the table without ceremony, took the chair across from Crail, and opened the accounts. "Gentlemen," she said, "I am Frances Holt. I managed the Sefton estate accounts for 16 years, and I am here to show you what is actually owed, what was manufactured, and what remains that is genuinely solvent." Crail smiled. "Miss Holt's familiarity with the household accounts is well known," he said. "But I am not sure this is the appropriate—" "The first transfer," Frances said, "occurred in the autumn of the 3rd year of the consolidated arrangement. Here is the entry." She opened the first ledger and turned it to face the room. Here is the account it was routed to. Here is the same account number appearing in the 5th year, the 6th year, and the 7th. She laid each ledger open beside the previous one as she spoke, building the row of evidence across the table with the calm precision of someone who has been preparing this demonstration for a very long time. Over 6 years, a total of 11 transfers, each structured to fall beneath the threshold of a standard annual audit. The total removed from the Sefton estate accounts amounts to this figure. She wrote it on a separate sheet and placed it in the center of the table. The room was still. "That figure," she continued, "represents the difference between an estate in manageable debt and an estate in crisis. The genuine debts, the ones that reflect actual obligations, amount to this." She wrote a second figure beside the first. "The Wraxall tenant properties and the working farmland generate this annual return." A third figure, which means that the core of the estate, properly managed, is solvent. The London house and its associated expenses are not and cannot be saved. But the land, the tenant families, and the household staff at Wraxall are not required to be part of any dispersal. One of the creditors leaned forward. "How do we know these figures are accurate?" "Because I kept them," Frances said, "and Mr. Dunmore has verified them independently." She opened the relevant page and placed it in front of the man who had asked. "You will find the verification notation there in Mr. Dunmore's hand, with the date." Crail had recovered himself. "The transfers you are describing," he said, and his voice carried its usual pleasant authority, were legitimate restructuring vehicles, properly documented. "The documentation is here," Frances said. She opened the satchel and produced the relevant pages and placed them in front of the two creditors closest to Crail. "You will note that the signatures on the restructuring authorizations are dated after the transfers they purport to authorize. In 2 cases, the authorization documents are dated 3 months after the funds had already moved. I would be glad to show you both instances." The room looked at the pages. Crail looked at Frances. "This is a fabrication," he said, and for the first time the pleasantness in his voice had an edge beneath it. "The ledgers are original," Frances said. "Mr. Dunmore can speak to their provenance. The routing entries are in the firm's own hand. The account numbers are verifiable through the bank's records, which I have also provided." She placed the final document on the table. "There is nothing in this room that I fabricated. There is a great deal in this room that you did." The quality of the silence that followed was particular. The silence of men recalculating, of attention shifting, of a room deciding which way it is going. The auction of Brook Street proceeded. The London house, the furnishings, the carriage, the social infrastructure of a viscount's life in the city. All of it went. And there was no saving it, and Frances had not come to save it. What was protected was the Wraxall core, the tenant farms, the cottages, the working land, the household staff's contracted positions. Garvey's family would not be dispersed. The 4 tenant families would not lose their homes. Mrs. Fenwick would have her position. Crail left the room without speaking again. He walked out through the tagged furniture and the white labels fluttering in the draft from the door, and no one in the room moved to stop him or to wish him well. Sefton stood at the back of the room and watched Frances close the satchel and fasten the clasp, and he understood, without needing to be told, that she had come for the tenants and the staff and for the justice of it. Not for him. The distinction applied to him, too. He understood that as well. He stood with it and did not look away from what it meant. 2 days after the meeting, Sefton sat at the writing desk in the reduced rooms he had taken in a quiet street off the Strand. No Brook Street, no club membership he could currently afford, no arrangement that Crail could call in, and wrote a letter declining the Overheard arrangement in terms that left no room for negotiation. He sealed it and had it sent, and then sat for a while in the quiet of the room, which was smaller than any room he had occupied as an adult, which was, he found, entirely adequate. He rode to Pennfold the following morning with no servant, no carriage, no preparation. He had thought about what he would say for the better part of 2 days, and had arrived at the conclusion that preparation was the wrong instrument for this particular conversation. He arrived at Mrs. Alderton's lodging house at midday, and Mrs. Alderton showed him up without ceremony. Frances was at her table. Dunmore's last account was closed and settled beside her, a neat stack of completed work. She looked up when he came in and waited. He stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands, and did not attempt to arrange his face into anything in particular. "I have declined Crail's arrangement," he said, "in writing this morning." "I know," she said. "Dunmore told me." "I have no London house," he said. "No club. Wraxall is functioning, but it is a reduced thing. I have lost most of what I had." "Yes," she said. "I am not here to tell you what I have lost," he said. "I am here to ask you one question, and I would like you to answer it honestly, because I think you are the only person who will." She waited. "Do you think," he said, "that I want you because I need the use of you? Or because I want you?" She held the question. She looked at him standing in the middle of her small sunny room with his hat in his hands and no performance left to give. And she held the question for a long moment in the way she held figures that needed to be correct before she wrote them down. "Which is it?" she said. Not a challenge. A genuine question, asked plainly, because she was asking him to know his own answer. He did not deflect. He did not reach for charm or for the comfortable authority of a man who expects the world to accept his version of things. He looked at her directly and said, "You. Only you. I understand now that this has been true for longer than I was capable of admitting, and I wasted a great deal of time not admitting it. And I am sorry for the waste." Frances stood up from her chair. She crossed the room and kissed him once, deliberately, without hesitation. Not a concession, not a reward, not a performance of forgiveness. A beginning, a woman choosing, fully and with open eyes, on her own terms. He kissed her back with the particular care of a man who understands that he is holding something he very nearly destroyed and will not be careless with again. The wedding took place some weeks later in the parish church at Wraxall, on a morning when the frost was still on the grass and the light came sideways through the east window and lay in long, pale bars across the stone floor. Cecily stood beside them in her best dress, which she had asked Mrs. Fenwick to press herself, and old Dunmore served as witness, signing the register in his small, deliberate hand with the satisfaction of a man who has watched something come right that he had hoped would come right for a considerable time. The register listed her as Frances Holt. The estate ledger, opened that same afternoon on the shared writing desk in the library at Wraxall, listed her differently. Co-signatory, her name beside his, written openly, without qualification, without apology, without the small, careful omissions that had characterized every document that had ever named her in connection with this household. She wrote her signature in her own hand and looked at it for a moment before she turned the page. The library at Wraxall was reduced, but functioning, fewer shelves than there had been, a simpler desk than the one that had gone at auction, a fire that was adequate rather than generous. It was enough. It was, in a way that the grander version had never quite been, genuinely theirs. The morning after the wedding, the light came through the east-facing window and crossed the open ledger on the desk, both names visible on the page. Below, in the garden that Frances had noticed was well tended when she first arrived in Pennfold, and which she had since learned was tended by the same woman who had tended it for 20 years. Cecily's voice carried upward through the cold, clear air, unhurried, calling for no one in particular, the way children call when they are simply glad to be where they are, because everyone they need is near.